So as people are drifting into this session, let me welcome you again to the second session of the Macro Day on Structural Transformation in Developing Countries. My name is Chris Adam. I'm a research associate at the CSAE, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this afternoon's session. I think we can proceed. It's my pleasure to invite Kristina Manysheva from Northwestern to kick us off. With a paper on land, property rights, financial frictions and resource allocation. Kristina, you have 15 minutes from now, and I will give you a 5-minute and a 1-minute warning. So the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. And thank you for providing me an opportunity to present my project, Land Property Rights, Financial Frictions, and Resource Allocation in Developing Countries. So the motivation for this paper comes from the facts that often characterize many developing countries in the world. The first one is that many of those countries are characterized by lack of access to credit and low levels of financial inclusion. At the same time, in those countries, land market is limited and property rights are not secure. The issue why those property rights are not secure are often customary tenure system and lack of land formalization. What it means in practice is that land cannot be sold or rented out, land is subject to expropriation risk, and land cannot be used as collateral. Those facts bring me to two important questions. The first one, what effect do land property rights and access to credit have on allocation of resources? And second, how do land and financial frictions affect economic development? And what is more important, what is the role of their intersection? To answer those questions, in my paper, I'm using both empirical and structural approaches. On the empirical side, I'm using detailed micro-level data from African countries, specifically from Tanzania, to first estimate agricultural production function and show that land indeed is a major input in agriculture in this country. And second, using those estimates, I'm providing empirical evidence of resource misallocation due to both land market imperfections and financial imperfections. And to answer the second question, what is the effect of those frictions on the economic development? I incorporate land and credit market frictions into heterogeneous agent macro model and use this model to quantify the effect of land and financial reforms in general equilibrium setting by performing a number of counterfactual exercises. Given the lack of time, I'm not going to go into much details for the literature. Just want to mention 3 strands of literature that I'm hoping to contribute to. The first one is the literature on misallocation of resources. The second one is on microdata and macro models. And finally, is the literature on productivity, development, and entrepreneurship. So let me start with empirical results. And here today in my presentation, I want to focus mostly on the structural part. Therefore, I'm only going to provide the overview or summary of empirical part of my paper. As I already mentioned, I'm using very detailed household and community level panel data from Tanzania to first estimate agricultural production function. And in order to address identification issues, I'm using dynamic panel approach. Then I'm using those estimates along with variation of land property rights and access to credit, both in time and across households, to provide evidence of resource misallocation due to land and financial market imperfections. To do that, I'm using very standard macro framework that implies that in the frictionless world, the amount of land that the farmer is using supposed to be proportional to his or her productivity. And in my paper, I'm using data to test whether this implication is actually holds. Then I perform a set of exercises where I relax different assumptions in my baseline framework. And finally, for robustness checks, I address selection issues by using IV approach, fixed effects, and exploiting different measures of land property rights. And the last but not the least, providing evidence of correlation between access to credit, occupational choice, entrepreneurship, and land property rights. All this empirical evidence guide me through my modeling choice. And let me start with the model framework. So the model I'm going to use in this paper is heterogeneous agent model, and agents are heterogeneous in 4 dimensions. The first one is their wealth or assets holding. The second one is land ownership. And finally, each household would have different abilities, both in agriculture and entrepreneurship. There is endogenous occupational choice, and there are 3 occupations that the household can choose from. The first one is being a farmer. The second one, operate the business and being an entrepreneur. And finally, being a worker who has been hired by the entrepreneur. All those occupations are mutually exclusive within the period T, but however, household can freely move from one occupation to another across time periods. In terms of frictions, the model incorporates both land and financial market frictions. On the land side, a fraction of economies' aggregate endowment of land, lambda L, is being communal. Or in other words, is the land that is not being titled or under an insecure property rights regime. This communal land could not be rented out. It's also subject to expropriation risk in case it's not being used in agricultural production process. And finally, this land could not be used as collateral. On the financial side, within period credit to finance capital is subject to collateral constraint. How my model different from other models with financial frictions is that I'm allowing to use both assets or wealth as collateral and also land, but land could be used as collateral only in case if it's in private regime or in secure property rights regime. So these last 2 points, collateral and financial frictions, incorporate intersection between 2 markets in my model. And finally, model has endogenous evolution of communal land and forward-looking saving decision. Just to give you a little bit more idea how those frictions incorporated in the model, let me show you household problem conditional on occupational output. Very standard household maximize his utility derived from consumption over his life period. And it's subject to budget constraint where all the income could be spent either on consumption or asset accumulation or savings. In terms of the income, there are 3 parts for each household. The first one is income derived from his occupation or from his work. The second one is interest rate income from the assets holding. And finally, the last part of income is coming from rental of the land holdings. However, this rental income is only available for those who under private property rights regime. On the financial side, household is subject to within period capital borrowing constraint. So the capital that is being used by entrepreneurs and by farmers in their production process is subject to a limit. It's a fraction of the household's wealth and also a fraction of the land holdings conditional on land being in the private regime. And finally, I restrict that assets holding could not be negative, or in other words, household could not borrow to smooth consumption across periods. Let me also describe how income from occupation from 3 different occupational choices is derived. So the income for entrepreneur is simply a profit from his business, where as inputs he's using labor and capital, paying wage to labor and rental rate on capital. For the worker, his income is simply the wage he receives at work. And finally, for the farmer, it's a profit from operating a farm or from his agricultural production, where he uses as inputs capital and land. And here, important to see that farmers do not hire any labor, and this is what we see in the context of African country, or what I see in Tanzanian data, that most of agricultural labor is coming within the household. And finally, things to mention, both entrepreneur and farmer produces the same homogeneous good. So there are going to be no relative prices between agricultural and non-agricultural output. So hope I gave you the brief idea how the model works and what is the main setting. And now I'm going to turn my attention to quantitative analysis. I'm focusing on competitive stationary equilibrium in my model, and I performed 3 sets of counterfactual experiments. The first one, I'm looking at on the effects of land reform, or what would happen in the economy in general equilibrium setting if we move from the mixture of communal and private land property rights regime to purely private land property rights regime. Second, given that in many developing countries, land reforms implementation is not always going as smooth as we expect, and not all channels actually being sort of eliminated, or all the frictions being eliminated, I'm decomposing these improvements in land property rights into various channels. Finally, I'm comparing the effect of land reform with the effect of financial reform. And I calibrate my model to Tanzanian economy in year 2013.
You've got about 5 minutes to go.
Thank you. So let me start with the first experiment and show you what is going to be general equilibrium result of moving towards 100% of private land. So as we can see, both agricultural and non-agricultural output is increasing, as well as consumption. On the occupational part of the model, you could see that households are moving from agriculture to other sectors. And let me just briefly describe what are the mechanisms why these occupational changes are happening. So first, removal of expropriation risks allow better labor allocation across households, since those who, based on their productivity, would be better off in other sectors but agriculture, they decide to stay in agriculture purely because they fear to lose their land in case it's not going to be cultivated. So those people moving to other sectors, or being workers or entrepreneurs. Second, removal of collateral constraint, or allowing bigger share of population to use land as collateral, relaxes this constraint, and first it leads to higher number of entrepreneurs, or those, for example, who did not have any wealth in terms of assets, but had land as land holdings, and being highly productive in entrepreneurship, they're moving to entrepreneurship. And second, relaxation of this capital constraint is also giving existing entrepreneurs ability to use more capital in their production. This also leads to the desire of those entrepreneurs also to hire more labor. And this, in turn, leads to increase in wage, and therefore more people moving from farming to being a worker. Because now, for some of them who are relatively not as productive in being farmer, can get better income being worker. Second experiment that I'm doing, I'm exploiting different mechanisms of land reform, but removing one friction at a time. So what I'm doing, I'm still looking at the general equilibrium effect, but instead of doing the entire land reform, I remove or improve only one part or only one friction at a time, and see how those, eliminating only one friction, how this affects the economy as a whole. So I already a little bit described how expropriation and collateral channel work and to what it lead. Now let me just explain a little bit more in detail how allowing those who in the communal regime, allowing them to rent out their land in case they do not use it, how this affects the economy. So as you can see here, we see the huge increase in agricultural output. And here's the important thing, this increase in agricultural output is not only driven by the fact that now allocation of resources is more effective and therefore productivity is increasing, but also in more mechanical sense, as now more land is being utilized, therefore land input is increasing, and therefore we have increase in agricultural output. At the same time, amount of farmers is increasing, and this is happening since due to higher land utilization or more land being available on the market, the price of land is decreasing, and therefore for more people or for more households, it's profitable to stay in agriculture.
You're at your last minute now.
Thank you. And here, the third exercise I'm doing, I'm comparing land reform and financial reform. And here I just want to give you a summary. So of course, it's very hard to compare them quantitatively, but I could compare them qualitatively. And qualitatively, financial reform leads to similar results as collateral channel of land reform, not as entire land reform, but as a collateral channel. And both of them lead to higher financial inclusion. The biggest difference between the outcomes of those reforms are distributional impacts. And speaking of distributional impacts, while we see in the land reform increase in welfare, their inequality increases slightly, as in most of reforms of such kind, and therefore we have some winners and losers. Among the biggest winners are those who, under insecure land property rights regime before the reform, and especially those who have large land holdings, but at the same time they being very poor in terms of their assets. And of course, this is the most pronounced for those with high entrepreneurial ability and relatively low agricultural ability. And the biggest losers, but they do not lose as much as the winners win, are those who already under private property rights regime due to, and especially those with high land holdings, as the price of land decreases. And let me conclude. In my paper, I show on the empirical side that insecure land property rights and limited access to credit associated with misallocation of resources. And using structural approach, I show that land reform leads to higher agricultural, non-agricultural output, and lower share of farmers and high share of entrepreneurs. Different aspects of land reform affect the economy differently, and while land reform generates positive welfare gains, they are not equally distributed. And in countries where policy space is limited, land reform should be an important focus, as it also leads to higher financial inclusion. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kristina. And you've covered an awful lot of ground in a very short period of time, for which we're most grateful. Can I ask Marcos to set his slides up? And while I'm doing so, just remind everyone, please post your questions to the Q&A. Let us know which paper you want to ask your question to, and we will get to them at the end of all 4 of the presentations. So thank you, Kristina. Marcos, you're ready to go, and I will give you a 5-minute warning when you get to that point. So thank you very much, Marcos.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here. I will present today the paper on rainfall and structural transformation in Sub-Saharan Africa. Structural transformation refers to the reallocation across broad sectors of the economy. And in this paper, it will refer to the reallocation of labor out of the agricultural sector towards non-agriculture. It will be about Sub-Saharan Africa for the period that goes from 1970 to 2014. And the focus of the paper will be on the impact of rainfall anomaly in the reallocation of labor out of the agricultural sector and also on aggregate productivity. It will be a cross-country analysis for 15 countries, and throughout the presentation, we will use this term rainfall anomaly that just refers to the deviation of rainfall relative to its long-run average divided by the standard deviation. It is sometimes also called the Z-score. Okay, so before anything, a few facts on Sub-Saharan Africa. A large share of workers are allocated in agriculture. In 1970, it was on average 73%. In 2014, it's still very large, 53%. So it's the main sector in terms of allocation of workers. And about 97% of the farming practices is said to be rain-fed. It means it relies only on rainfall water, what makes the agricultural production very dependent on weather and climate conditions. We do observe that the 80s and 90s is a period characterized of large droughts. Okay, so we do observe large negative rainfall anomaly and also stagnation of GDP per capita growth. Okay, so there is a strong correlation between rainfall anomaly and GDP per capita growth in SSA. So what I do in this paper, it builds on this Schultz food problem idea, it is an idea that goes back to the 50s, in which until countries can produce a sufficient amount of food, labor is trapped in agriculture. So the main mechanism that I have in mind is that the main mechanism to push workers out of agriculture towards the non-agricultural sector, it is productivity growth in agriculture. Okay, so the idea is that droughts represent a negative shock on agricultural productivity. Okay, so the mechanism I have in mind of a negative rainfall anomaly is that it decreases labor productivity in agriculture, so more workers are necessary to produce an appropriate amount of food, which postpones the reallocation of labor out of the agricultural sector. But because the non-agricultural sector has much higher productivity, it has a large impact on aggregate labor productivity. Okay, so in 1970, on average, it was labor productivity in non-agriculture was about 10 to 12 times higher than in agriculture, and in 2014 was still large, like 6 to 7 times. Okay, so postponing the reallocation of labor towards the non-agricultural sector may have large aggregate impacts. Okay, so the idea I have in mind is that a drought may have a direct impact on agricultural labor productivity, but it also slows down the reallocation out of agriculture towards the non-agricultural sector. So what I do in this paper is I quantify the impact of rainfall anomaly in the structural transformation of Sub-Saharan Africa. There is in the reallocation of labor out of agriculture and also on aggregate productivity. And I do so by the means of a counterfactual. I ask, how would the economy have behaved if there were no droughts? Okay, so the steps I follow up. I use a production function to measure the impact of rainfall anomaly on agricultural labor productivity. And then once I have the estimated production function, I construct the counterfactor. I construct the counterfactor, that is, how would the labor productivity in agriculture have grown if there were no droughts? Okay, and then I feed the counterfactor labor productivity into a general equilibrium structural transformation framework to endogenize the allocation of labor across sectors. Okay, so I find a large impacts in the countries of Western Africa and Ethiopia. The share of labor in agriculture, if there were no droughts, the share of labor in agriculture would be on average 1.4% lower than observed. Aggregate productivity would be on average 8.3% higher, and the reallocation margin between the sectors accounts on average for 47% of the impacts on aggregate productivity. For the case of Burkina Faso, on average, labor would be 1.9% lower than observed, and aggregate labor productivity in 2014 would be $623 in PPP. Okay, so I start with this picture of the average rainfall anomaly in Sub-Saharan Africa. The World Bank provides data on rainfall starting 1901 at a country level. So what I do, I compute the rainfall anomaly for 15 countries. I take the trend using HP filter and then I average them out. It's a simple average. Okay, we do observe that in the first half of the 20th century, rainfall anomaly was relatively small. In the 50s and 60s, it was large and positive. And then we do observe that the 80s and 90s, there is a large negative rainfall anomaly, and it is also a period of stagnation of GDP per capita growth. But as usual, there is a large heterogeneity between the countries. So here I show the average rainfall anomaly for the period that goes from 1970 to 2014. As we do observe, the countries from Western Africa suffering more heavily from droughts, but we also observe negative average on Ethiopia, Malawi, and Mozambique. Other countries like Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Namibia, South Africa, and Lesotho, they actually had positive average of rainfall. Okay, in the particular case of Senegal and Burkina Faso, every period was characterized as a period of negative rainfall anomaly. Okay, so I use the production specification from Dow Jones and Oakland to measure the impact of climate on labor productivity. So rainfall anomaly impacts the level of labor productivity in agriculture with parameter gamma A, but it also impacts the growth of labor productivity with parameter phi A, and the growth of labor productivity also depends on an exogenous term, epsilon ZA. Okay, so this production specification gives me an equation on the growth of labor productivity in agriculture that depends on the variation of the rainfall anomaly, on the level, and on the exogenous term. Okay, so I use this equation 4 as reference for my specification to measure the impact of rainfall anomaly on productivity growth. And here I show 3 results. In the first one, I show a simple OLS regression without any fixed effects, and none of the coefficients are significant. Once I do introduce fixed effects, the coefficient associated with the rainfall impact is significant, but the one associated with the change in rainfall, it's not significant. And then in the third column, I show the results of adding an interaction term between rainfall and negative average. So it's a dummy that takes the value of 1 if we observe a negative average in the country and 0 otherwise. Okay, so it takes the value of 1 if in the map it was dark red, red on orange, and 0 if it was blue. Once I added this interaction term, only this coefficient is significant, while the rainfall coefficient it's not significant anymore. So this suggests a potential asymmetry on the impacts of rainfall on labor productivity growth, okay, in which when we do observe persistent droughts, that would represent a negative impact on agricultural productivity growth. When we do observe positive, that would not represent a positive shock. Okay, so I use these results to calibrate the production function, and I do set gamma A equals 0 and phi A equals 0.02. So this indicates that if rainfall anomaly equals 1 standard deviation, there is equal -1, that reduces labor productivity growth in agriculture by 2%. Okay, so having the value of gamma, phi, and the rainfall anomaly, I calculate the exogenous term such that it reproduces the productivity growth in agriculture exactly. That's just the exogenous variation term. Okay, and then once I have this exogenous variation, I said, suppose there were no droughts, no rainfall anomaly, there is T equals 0, then I construct my counterfactor using the exogenous variation term. Okay, so here I show how I construct the counterfactor for the case of Burkina Faso. Okay, so for Burkina Faso, we see that normalized labor productivity in agriculture would grow from 1970 until 2014 with some stagnation in the 80s. And on the right-hand side, I show the rainfall anomaly for the particular case of Burkina Faso. We observed that rainfall anomaly was quite negative, large Burkina Faso in the 80s. Then it went back. And from the lens of the exercise, it is as if there were negative rainfall shocks in every period in Burkina Faso that goes from 1970 to 2014. Okay, and then I use it to construct my counterfactor. That is, how would labor productivity in agriculture grow in Burkina Faso if there were no rainfall anomaly? There is if it was always equals to 0, and then I get this dashed line. Okay, I do so for the 8 countries in which we observed the negative average. Okay, so
we've got about 5 minutes to go.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, so now I have constructed the counterfactor productivity in agriculture, and then I will feed the observed and the counterfactor into a general equilibrium framework to capture the total impacts of droughts in the economy. Okay, so the model is, we'll just give an overview of the model. The model is simple. It has 2 sectors of production, agriculture and non-agriculture. The production function in agriculture, it is as just discussed. In non-agriculture is also linear in labor. Household supplies labor inelastically, and also it has non-homothetic utility over the consumption of agricultural and non-agricultural goods. Okay, non-homothetic preferences implies changes in the consumption patterns associated with changes in income. So the idea is that at low levels of income, household spend most of its income in the expenditure of agricultural goods, but as it gets richer, it starts to consume relatively more non-agricultural goods relative to agriculture. Okay, and then once I have calibrated and estimated the model, I use the benchmark version of it to identify potential reallocation barriers between the sectors. Okay, so what I do is I introduce some distortions on labor demand, and those will be calculated such that the model labor share equals the data. Okay, so I will back up some reallocation barriers in which I'm gonna force my model to reproduce the data exactly, and then in such a way that I can get only the drought margin. Okay, so by construction, if I simulate the model with the observed agricultural productivity, non-agricultural productivity, and those reallocation barriers, it replicates the economy exactly. Okay, so now to measure the impact of rainfall anomaly. I ask how would the economy have behaved if there were no rainfall anomaly? I simulate the economy with the counterfactual labor productivity, the non-agricultural productivity, and the reallocation barriers. Okay, so here I show the results for Burkina Faso. If there were no rainfall anomalies, okay, we would observe that with the green dashed line, labor share in agriculture would be persistent lower than in the data that is given by the blue line. Okay, in the panel B, I show the total impacts on aggregate labor productivity. Okay, so the green dashed line will give me the total impact of rainfall on aggregate productivity. There is the direct impact together with the reallocation. So to disentangle the two mechanisms, the direct from the reallocation, I recalculate aggregate productivity using the counterfactual labor productivity in agriculture, but the observed labor share in agriculture. Okay, so the distance between the orange triangle line to the blue line gives me the direct impact of droughts on aggregate productivity, and the distance between the green dashed line to the orange triangle dashed line gives me the reallocation margin. Okay, so I performed this exercise for the 8 countries, and here I show the impacts for all of them. Okay, so in the case of Burkina Faso, the direct impacts represent 64% of the total impact on aggregate productivity, while the reallocation margin represents 35%. So we could have very different results, like Cameroon, the reallocation margins actually represent 72%, while the direct impacts 27.5%, while in Ghana, the reallocation margin, it is only 18%, while the direct would be 81%. So getting a simple average of the reallocation margin, we would get 47%. Okay, so it accounts for about 47% of the total impact on aggregate productivity because of large difference on labor productivity across the sectors. So
you're in your final minute. I think you can just wrap up.
So my final slide. So on aggregate productivity in PPP, in Burkina Faso, aggregate productivity would be, I construct sectoral prices in PPP. In Burkina Faso, aggregate productivity would be $623 higher than observed. Okay, the direct impact now accounts for 56%, reallocation for 44%, and aggregate labor productivity would be 15% higher. So in the case of Ghana, it would be also about the same, $620 higher than observed, but that only represents 5.4% of the aggregate labor productivity. Okay, once I compute the prices in PPP, reallocation margin accounts on average for 54% because it increases the dispersion of the value of labor productivity across the sectors. Okay, so to conclude, in this paper, I find that persistent droughts have large impacts in the structural transformation process of Sub-Saharan Africa, labor reallocation, and aggregate productivity, and it calls attention that the reallocation margin represents an important mechanism given the large differences of productivity across the sector, and it may account for about 50% of the total impact. Okay. And I stop here.
Thank you very much, Marcos, and sorry for pushing you a little bit at the end. That was excellent. Thank you very much indeed. So, Marcos, if you unmute, then I think we're on to Emmanuel. Is Sub-Saharan Africa deindustrializing? So, Emmanuel, you too have 15 minutes. I will remind you at 5 minutes to go and 1 minute to go.
Sorry. Hello, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share my research. My name is Emmanuel Mensah. I'm a postdoc at the University of Groningen. I'm also a fellow at the Groningen Growth and Development Center. So in this research, I stepped into the debate of deindustrialization in Africa. So on the 18th and the 18th of March, there was this interesting article in The Economist, which basically captures some of our new findings here at Groningen. And there is this simple but profound statement that captured my imagination. And the statement is The Economist quoted Mr. Ibrahim Sarr, who is a general manager of a manufacturing firm in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the statement is, he who makes has the power. And we can relate this very profound statement to some of the historical and also recent experiences of some key economies in the world. So if you look at Britain, for example, Britain became a very important global economic and political power through the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and the 19th century. And more recently, China has also become a very important geopolitical force by developing arguably by developing its industrial power. So in simple terms, we know that industrialization has been the main route of economic development. And industrialization initiated a long period of prosperity in the West, so categorizing the West as rich and many other countries as poor, and also more recently, the East Asian miracle, arguably, is also a story of industrialization. However, Roderick in his seminal paper argued that Sub-Saharan Africa, which could potentially become the next labor-intensive manufacturing hub, is deindustrializing. And with it, this is worrying because industrialization is the main route of development and is the main hope for many African countries to develop. However, the result of Roderick seems to suggest that this route is cut off, or at best is very difficult. It will be very difficult for many Sub-Saharan African countries. And this has motivated a series of research that seems to suggest that the role of manufacturing as a driver of long-run development is diminishing in Africa. Others have proposed modern services as an alternative to manufacturing-based development in the region. However, there are two reasons why I think it is too soon to conclude that Africa is deindustrializing. The first one is that the sample of countries in the data that Roderick uses it basically comprises of 11 countries. In fact, when he actually excludes Mauritius, so 10 countries. And Sub-Saharan Africa is a very big, it comprises 46 different countries. Perhaps the most important reason why I think it is too soon to conclude that Africa is deindustrialized is the recent statistical reforms that has improved sectorial indicators in Africa. For much of the 1980s and 90s, because of the political and economic crisis in many Sub-Saharan African countries, there's no investment in statistical capacity. As a result, many of these GDP or manufacturing GDP estimates were based on economic census, which leaves out many informal manufacturing activities. But more recently, there's more effort into collecting data that covers both formal and informal sector. As a result, sectorial indicators have improved. Okay, so the simple objective of this paper is to examine to the extent to which the premature deindustrialization results will change when we use new sectorial indicators and also increase the sample of countries in the database. So the answer to this question is important for the reason that if we see contrary evidence about the patterns of industrialization, then the argument for manufacturing-led development in Africa may still be relevant. Okay. So I begin this exploration by looking at the existing data that Roderick and many other scholars use in their analysis. And the data is the Africa Sector Database constructed here at Groningen Growth and Development Center. and which is also integrated into the 10 sector database. The database basically covers 11 countries in Africa, and this set of countries, as it has been argued by Diao and Macmillan in their 2017 paper, focuses on relatively rich African countries, which have relatively high health and income advisors, high health and nutritional outcomes, and raises question about the representativeness of these countries for empirical analysis or for inductive generalization. And the most important reason is that this database was constructed before the recent statistical revision that has improved sectorial indicators in Africa. So what I do is that I extend the number of countries and time series to address some of these concerns and take into account the recent statistical revision across Africa and account for key informality in key sectors of the economy. So the primary data sources for constructing this data is national account, for value added, we use national the production side, and for population and labor force surveys, we use population census, labor force and household surveys for employment. The general approach is that it's a GGDC approach, which basically for real value added, I use the recent revisions of statistical information as benchmark, and I use historical growth rate to extrapolate backwards to the 1960s. And for employment, because the population census covers both formal and informal sectors, I use the population employment information for population census as benchmarks and interpolate between benchmark years using either labor force surveys, household surveys, or labor productivity trend. So this resulted in a new sectorial database that I call the Extended Africa Sector Database, which covers 80% of GDP in Africa, and that is more reflective of the current size and structure of many of the 18 African countries I covered. So basically, I try to look at some of the patterns, and this the horizontal axis shows the average manufacturing share in the first 15 years, that's 1960 to 1975. And the vertical or the y-axis shows the last 15 years, 2000 to 2015. You can see the dashed line, the 45 degrees line. You can see that the average share of many African countries, employment share of many are above the 45 degree line. Of course, there are also countries below the 45 degree line, which means that the employment share of these countries in the 1960s is higher than in the 2000s, basically suggesting that these countries seems to be deindustrialized. But for majority of these countries, they are not. This seems to suggest that they are not deindustrializing in employment. So I also look at the real value added, and again, only a few countries are below the 45 degree line. The majority of the countries are above the 45 degree. This was nicely captured in the economists. Basically, you see the trend from 1960s in this article, and it's also after the 2000s, you see that manufacturing employment is rising. This also shows the relative productivity, but because of time, I will just skip. So formally, I now approach this question more formally by using the type of regression that has been in development. It has been a long tradition in development economics, but popularized by Roderick in his 2016 paper. Basically, a control for demographic and income trends in relation to what Marcos was saying, that structural change using non-homothetic preferences relate to income. So therefore, we expect a ham-shaped relationship between income and manufacturing activities and also population, which I can talk about later, but because of time, I'll just. And for the second equation, and we capture the pattern of need using the decadal damage. So, and also control for country-specific effect. For the second equation, we allow this decadal damage to vary by country to be able to map up country-specific patterns. Okay, so this is the result based on the expanded Africa sector database. Basically, what it's after controlling for income, despite the descriptions are showing some positive trend after controlling for income and demographic trends. See that employment is declining over time, However, real output is increasing. The manufacturing share of real output is increasing relative to the 1960s. Okay, and this holds regardless of whether we include or exclude Mauritius, as Roderick did in his paper.
Emmanuel,
so
just be aware you've got about 5 minutes to go.
Okay, so I visualized these patterns, and basically you also show the difference where income is, the manufacturing share of value added is increasing, while the manufacturing share of employment is at least up to the 2000s. Okay, and these are the country-specific patterns. That is not all, even for employment, it's not all countries that are deindustrializing. Some countries are actually industrializing, even for manufacturing share of employment. Okay, we can talk about this later. So I'll skip the robustness and basically look at the more recent results. In my paper, I documented that up to the 2000s, there was deindustrialization for employment. In the recent paper, where we constructed a new database called the Economic Transformation Database with my colleagues at Groningen and UNU wider, we show that there is a manufacturing renaissance. Basically, the declining employment share that I showed in the previous slides, there's a reversal of employment, particularly for Sub-Saharan Africa and also developing Asia. Okay. This was also captured beautifully in the Economist on last week, basically March 18, which basically shows the pattern that I just showed about. So for Sub-Saharan Africa, you can see a rapid upward trend of industrialization, and also following closely to the coefficient. This is the estimated percentage point difference with respect to 1990. That's basically controlling for demographic and income effect. Okay, so as I showed in the previous slides, there's basically at least up to the early 2000s, before the industrialization trend reversed, there was this gap between real value added, manufacturing share of real value added, and also manufacturing share of employment. There's this gap, and this could potentially capture the productivity effect. So I tried to examine this formally by controlling for all the important indicators of manufacturing activities, and also including in productivity to capture whether productivity is indeed having this long-run effect of declining employment in African industry. And I used two measures of productivity. There's a log of productivity and unbalanced labor productivity group to capture the idea of almost cause disease. And I basically use the instrumental variable GMM approach to estimate to avoid potential endogenic. And because I couldn't find any appropriate exogenous instrumental variable, I used the lag of these productivity measures. Okay, and basically the result, after controlling for all the key variables like income and demographic and trading manufacturers, macroeconomic variables, basically shows that log unit in manufacturing productivity actually decreases manufacturing employment by 3.5%. And also when you use the unbalanced labor productivity group, which is basically the difference between productivity in manufacturing and services, it shows that the productivity of manufacturing, I prefer the third model. The productivity of manufacturing is increases by 1 unit relative to the service sector. You can also see a declining employment trend. And this basically relates to the research finding by Macmillan and Roderick, which they call the manufacturing puzzle in Africa. And what they show is that large firms in Africa experience productivity growth but do not create jobs, whereas smaller firms absorb workers but also do not experience much productivity growth in the context of Tanzania and Ethiopia. And basically what you see is that the large firms, because they are more competitive and they are able to engage in international trade, they are likely to survive and therefore their effect basically dominates in the long run. And therefore, that's why this potentially could explain why we see this manufacturing, the declining manufacturing employment, whereas real value added of manufacturing is increasing in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, you've got just about 30 seconds to sum up. So can you make this your final?
Okay, so to conclude, the evidence clearly shows that Africa is not deindustrializing, and depending, and the result is particularly sensitive to the sample size, depending on the number of countries you use in the regression, you either see deindustrialization or deindustrializing. And if you increase the samples particularly and take into account the recent statistical deviation, the result particularly shows a very positive manufacturing trend over time. So which this carries very important implication. The result basically means that industrialization for many African countries, industrialization is still possible for many of the Sub-Saharan African countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you very much for that presentation. Let's move quickly on to our final presentation. Keep the questions coming, members of the audience, and in 15 minutes time after our final presentation, I'll open it up for wider discussion. So for the moment, Harouna, the floor is yours. Corruption and distortion of public expenditures, evidence from Africa. You're currently on mute, Harouna.
Okay, thank you. Thank the organizer for the opportunity to present our paper on corruption and distortion of public expenditure evidence from Africa. So the outline of our presentation is quite classical. We will begin by talking about the motivation of the paper, the contribution to literature, the empirical strategy, the data, the result, and we will conclude. So corruption is defined as the misuse of public office for private gain, according to literature. So as you can see, according to the data of the World Bank World Governance Indicators, Africa is perceived as the most corrupted continent in the world, that is the blue one, and Europe is perceived as the less corrupted continent in the world, that is the yellow one. As an example, the African Development Bank estimates that Africa is losing about 148 billion each year due to corruption. This represents about 6% of its 2015 GDP. This raises our research question: what are the consequences of this corruption on the allocation of public spending? The aim of this study is to investigate the distorting impact of corruption on the trade-off between capital and current expenditure in African countries. So our assumption is that because of its nature, corruption could lead to a distortion of public spending at the expense of capital expenditure. And these capital expenditure are made up of major investment projects, which allocation require call for tenders. On this segment of expenditure, information asymmetry is low, and the corruption practice is more easy. And however, on current expenditure is dominated by more simplified and more discretionary contract. On this segment of expenditure, the corruption practice is more easy than capital expenditure. So why evaluate the effect of corruption on the proportion of capital expenditure meter for African countries? First, capital expenditure is strategic for economic growth and long-term development, according to some studies. However, on our period of study, the capital expenditure is less than 30% on average in Africa. Second, the growth of African population require a continuous increase in the provision of public service. This requires an increase in the proportion of capital expenditure. And finally, the GDP per capita of Sub-Saharan Africa is about 6.5 times less than the world average. And this development gap requires specific investment on human capital, in innovation, in infrastructure that could be difficult to finance if the constrained African resource is misallocated through corruption phenomenon. So this study contributes by measuring the distorting impact of corruption on the proportion of capital expenditure. So corruption affects public expenditure composition by sector, according to some studies. But however, to the best of our knowledge, no study have investigated the potential effect of corruption on the trade-off between capital and current expenditure. So we fill this gap. So we estimate the impact of corruption on the structure of public spending through the following equation. CEP is our dependent variable. It's capital expenditure proportion in the country I at the time T. So we use two measures for our dependent variable, capital expenditure proportion. First, by reporting capital expenditure on the total expenditure. And second, by reporting capital expenditure on current expenditure. And corruption is our variable of interest. So we are expecting negative effect of corruption on capital expenditure proportion. And X represents the other control. C is the country specific effect. T is the time effect. U represent our error term. So we estimate this equation with panel fixed effect. Fixed effect have advantages by purging country specific and time invariant effect, but potential problem that could bias our result is the problem of endogeneity. There are three main sources of endogeneity in general. There are reverse causality, measurement error, and omitted variable bias. Here we expect reverse causality, as the allocation of public expenditure can also fuel the rent-seeking behavior. Also, they can have measurement error, as we are using perception data to measure corruption, and this data can have some correlation with economic performance. To identify the causal effect, we estimate the equation using instrumental variable methods. Here we use accountability as an instrument for corruption. This was used in the literature by Edge and Edge et al. To evaluate the effect of corruption on economic performance. There are two conditions to validate our instrument. First, accountability should be correlated with corruption. That is the case, and be exogenous. So according to the literature, this seems to be the case also. Our sample covers 48 African countries over the period from 2000 to 2016. We don't take into account Eritrea, Liberia, Libya, Somalia, South Sudan, and Zimbabwe, because we lack reliable public finance data for these countries. So we compiled disaggregated data on public finance for African countries based on African statistical yearbooks of African Statistical Coordination Committee. Data on corruption and democracy come respectively from the World Bank World Governance Indicators and the Political Risk Service. So we use also well development indicators data for our over control, mainly GDP per capita, the population aged from 0 to 14, the urban population share, the official development assistance per capita, the access to electricity and natural resource rent. An ideal measure of public corruption will be the frequency or amount of bribe exchanged per year in the country. But that kind of data is quite difficult to have. And for this study, we use proxy of corruption. We use perception data of the World Bank World Governance Indicators mainly, but we use also other source of corruption for robustness check. Here, corruption reflect the perception of the extent to which public power is exercised for private gain, including both petty and grand form of corruption, as well as capture of the state by elites and private interests. The measurement of corruption through perception is relevant, especially when the study is about public institutions. To facilitate the interpretation of our result, we transform these indicators on the scale of from 0 to 1. 1 is the highest level of corruption. This is our basic result. This is the estimation of the effect of corruption on the capital expenditure proportion by fixed effect. As you can see, when we use corruption only as explanatory variable, the effect on capital expenditure is negative as we are expecting, and significant at 1% level. When we add the other control, the effect is still negative and significant. When we add also natural resource rent, the effect is still negative and significant. And when we add also democracy, the effect is still negative and significant.
You've got about 5 minutes to go, Harouna.
Okay, thank you. So even if the fixed effects have advantage of present country-specific effects over limitation associated with empirical studies may be of concern for this study. So they include alternative scenario and methodology. So we try to see if our results differ according to different democratic regimes. To do so, we use Polity4, our political risk service. We've broken down on 3 suggested democratic regimes: autocracies, democracies, and anocracies and democracies. As you can see, when we control with different democratic regime, the effect of corruption is still negative and significant. So we try now to see if our results differ according to different type of natural resources. We've broken down natural resources in its main component, mainly oil rent, mineral rent, and forest rent. As you can see, when we control with different resource rent, the effect of corruption on capital expenditure is still negative and significant. As we use perception data to measure corruption, we try also to use our source of corruption measure for a business check. So here we use public sector corruption of varieties of democracy, VDEM data, and as you can see, the effect of corruption is still negative and significant on our 2 dependent variables. Now, to evaluate the causal effect of corruption on capital expenditure, we use instrumental variable estimation with accountability as an instrument. As you can see, the effect is negative and significant to corruption. The coefficient is roughly higher than the basic result. So to conclude, we can say that we give empirical evidence using fixed effect and two-stage least square estimation that an increase in the corruption by 1 standard deviation is associated with a decrease in the proportion of capital expenditure by 13 percentage points. This misallocation of public resources is a source of inefficiency in African countries. So the study, the result suggests that anti-corruption campaign aimed at increasing transparency in procurement of public spending should not overlook the trade-off between capital and current expenditure. In consequence, greater attention must be paid to a proportion of capital expenditure in public development policies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Harouna. That was excellent. And thank you for being so efficiently on time. Right, we have just about, we've 22 minutes for questions and answers. I've been collecting a few, and I would like to call on Daniela, who I think has a question for Marcos. So Daniela, if you're online, please unmute and give your question.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for these interesting papers. Thank you, Chris, for moderating this really interesting panel. My question is for Marcolino. I would like to know a little bit more about which are the policy implications for African economies in the face of climate change, which probably will increase rainfall anomalies. Is there any projection about how the effects of climate change on productivity will increase over the years?
So this one goes to me. So in the particular case of the paper, the goal was to quantify the impact by endogenizing the reallocation mechanism. Okay, so directly from the paper, I didn't look for specific policy implications. On a more general view based on climate change, one of the in general, simulations tends to indicate that negative impacts on agricultural productivity in Sub-Saharan Africa. So one potential implication is that labor would be trapped in agriculture and would move more slowly out of the agricultural sector. Okay, so one potential implication is to make the structural transformation process a little bit slower than what we would observe otherwise. Okay, that leads to lower income growth. So,
can I just follow up on Daniela's question there? Because I think it's a really nice point. And there's a couple of things in your paper that I was slightly concerned about, that whether you end up understating the productivity loss. And one is the way you construct this anomaly. It's off the back of an HP filter. So in a sense, you're taking out the trend and then looking at the anomaly relative to the trend. And arguably, it's the long-run trend movements in climate that are as important as the short-run volatility, especially in the broader climate change and structural transformation story. So I was concerned that there may be an important part of the story that is mechanically being thrown away. So long-term trend movements in rainfall patterns. And then the second point, which is a more detailed point, is to what extent are you able to reflect endogenous crop selection in response to trend movements in rainfall? Are households investing more in drought-resistant variants of crops because of this effect? And so you may get a non-linear productivity response to ongoing climate change.
Okay, so on the question about the trend, I used the trend mostly because I was concerned about more long-run effect, about persistent droughts and not one period big drought. So I have tried to estimate it with it. You also need to put some additional terms into the regression, but I was getting about the same result. So that's why I end up focusing more on the long run trends, because I was worried about persistent drought, okay? Because structural transformation is also a long run phenomenon. So that's why I end up focusing on the trend. About the endogenous choice of crops and how farmers could endogenously adapt to changes in the weather, I'm considering exogenous growth here. So from the lens of the model, I cannot say much about those adaptations, given that it's a historical paper that it's focusing on in the past. Some countries we don't see so much increase in fertilizers and all, so I cannot say so much about that. But that could be definitely an issue, especially when we do think about climate change as a very long run phenomenon in which the agricultural producers could end up adapting to persistent changes in the weather.
Thank you. My next speaker, thank you, Daniela. The next question is from Callum, who I think has a question for Emmanuel on is Sub-Saharan Africa deindustrializing? Callum, the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm sorry, the place I'm in has become very noisy, so I'll try and keep it quick. I'd actually like to ask a question linking both of the last two papers about corruption and industrialization. I think that question is more interesting. We know between industrial cities and consumer cities, and that industrial cities lend themselves much less well to corruption than consumer cities. And I was wondering, therefore, if Emmanuel had any thoughts or optimistic thoughts about the possibility for industrialization or reindustrialization as an antidote for corruption, and if Harouna had considered the sort of division between the two types of urban landscape and whether or not countries are industrializing or not as a possible determinant of corruption. I thought that was probably a more interesting question.
Okay,
is evidence of this kind of long-term settling effect or not? Thanks.
Okay, I think the line is not great, Callum, so I think we're going to focus on the first one that you presented about urbanization, industrialization, and corruption. So Emmanuel and Harouna, who wants to go first? Emmanuel, why don't you start? And
okay, let me go first. Callum, thank you very much for your interesting question, putting these different papers together in a very nice question. Okay, my thought on industrialization and corruption, I look at these two variables through democracy, right? We know that historically the industrialization allowed the labor union to develop into Labour Party that held many governments accountable. And so if you look at the Roderick's paper on premature deindustrialization, one of the arguments he made, a nice argument he made in the conclusion, is the political consequences of deindustrialization. And his argument is that if developing countries experience deindustrialization, they will miss a nice opportunity to develop their democracies through the power of labor unions, through labor and many labor actions, okay? So in Africa, I think the industrialization is very important in fighting corruption. If we think about industrialization helping countries to build, one, their wealth that allows more people to voice to participate in civic activity, to be more educated and demand the government to do the right thing. So there are so many ways that you can think about this. You can think about it through the income, that as people become richer, they get educated, and they become more aware of policy, and they demand their government to take the right action. You can also think about it through the development of democracy through labor, active labor participation. So that would be my take on your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Harouna, do you want to add anything?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think also that the corruption have an effect on the deindustrialization, as corruption affect negatively the productive sector. There are some, for example, there are some work who try to sound that corruption have negative effects on the enterprise than taxation. So I think that there are some effects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Can I turn to Jorgen, who had a question, and Jorgen also is concerned about being able to unmute yourself. So hopefully, oh, clearly you can. So Jorgen, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice presentations. I had a question for Emmanuel. In your specification, and I don't remember the details now, but you were controlling for population.
Yeah.
So I was kind of wondering, is there a difference if you would control for the total labor force? Because I think when you look at the earlier periods, population growth, labor force growth is basically the same, 2-3%. But when you enter into after 2000, some countries has already started, to have the demographic transition. So labor force growth is much higher than population growth. So I was kind of curious about that specification. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorgen, for this nice question. Yes, the reason that I control for I use population is to follow this long tradition starting from January in the 1960s, but also Roderick in his recent paper, 2016 paper. So basically that's because the base paper is Roderick's paper, which I'm trying to update with more new data and new evidence, right? So it's important that I keep that the model of Roderick in mind for comparison. But on a more theoretical argument, the idea is to control for the size of market. So for a particular income level, the bigger your population, the bigger your market size. And this market size relates to manufacturing activities. That is why, in my opinion, population is a more preferred variable than labor force.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I've got two more questions. One from myself for Kristina, and then I'm going to ask Paul. He had a question for Harouna. So, Kristina, I thought your really nice paper that you presented. Now, two things struck me, and maybe it's because I looked at it very quickly. One is an empirical question, the other is a model question. Let me start with the latter. Am I right in thinking that you have homothetic preferences in this model for the two goods? Or is it, well, no, it's a homogeneous, a single homogeneous good that you have. Does that not skew your analytical results? When you're looking at agriculture and the production of food, should you not be sort of starting from a non-homothetic setup to reflect the sort of fundamental Engel curve in the demand for agricultural output? That's my theory question. And then the empirical question is, you put a lot of weight on expropriation risk. And I've seen this discussed in many circumstances, that people are concerned about leaving land because of an inability to recover it in the future. what's our empirical understanding of this? How important is this as a risk?
Okay, thank you so much for your question. So I'm going to start with the model choice. It's true, I have one homogeneous good, therefore there is makes no sense to do no homothetic preferences since I don't have relative prices. And it's also true that many papers start with that, but given the model complication, it already has 4 state variables, it has 4 prices and everything. And I think the key in my model is the interaction term, and this is the most novel part of the model because there were papers that studied the implication of improvement of land property rights, and obviously there are a big part of literature is focusing on financial frictions. So I think the big part of this is bringing together those frictions because, for example, in Tanzania, one of the key arguments for land reform is actually because then you could use land as collateral, and there is actually an evidence that in some pilot programs that people were using land as collateral to obtain the credit. And given that this is often comes as a key part, so I wanted to focus on this part. And unfortunately, I have to give up some other dimensions, and non-homotheticity of preferences, this is a dimension I'm giving up. On the second part, on the empirical part, so in the empirical part, testing like allocation or like efficiency of allocation of resources in the data by using 4 different measures of land property rights. And one of them is in the data or in the survey, they ask directly the question, whether you're afraid to leave land fallow or uncultivated due to risk of expropriation. And actually, of course, all 4 measures, so like the other 3 is whether you have formal title, the third one, whether you obtain this land for free or not, and the final one, whether you're able to sell land or use it as collateral. Of course, all of them are correlated, but the ones that you're asking about, like what is a whether you're afraid to leave land fallow, and what I see in the data is that actually, despite the fact that amount of land titles is approximately like 14%, maybe 20% at this point of time, like 95% of people do not afraid to leave land fallow. And this is what I'm capturing in my model. So actually the probability that your land going to be expropriated and relocated to somebody else if you don't use it is only 9% based on the survey. So actually this risk, if anything, in my model is therefore like it has very little contribution because it's so tiny, because people, and I think this is the right question to ask, because it's not only, it's about people's perception, because labor misallocation arises from people being afraid, right, to lose the land. And therefore, this is what I'm using in the model. And indeed, this probability is not very high.
Oh, sorry, I need to unmute. Thank you very much for that, Kristina. We're getting right to the very end and we're getting a flood of questions. So I'm going to take 3 very quick questions, and I hope that the authors can respond to whichever questions they can in the time, but it does require the questioners, and that's Paul, and then John Struthers, and then Christian Lipich, to present their questions in no more than 20 seconds. Okay, so Paul first.
Yeah, thanks very much for a nice presentation on corruption. I just wanted to ask how the results sit with what is observed, especially around development projects in Sub-Saharan Africa. The more development projects seem to be happening, the greater the chances of corruption, and therefore some positive correlation around that, basically opportunities for graft. And then the second part of it is, and I don't know how the model accounted for this, whether the source of funding really matters. For example, does funding from development partners, that is donors, register greater corruption or less, or funding from the domestic resources or from the private sector? It would be useful to understand that in the context of your model. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And actually, with the greatest respect, Christian, I'm going to leave yours as a comment to Kristina, rather than the question, because it goes back over similar ground. So I'm going to close final question for John, if that's okay, John Struthers.
Thank you. I appreciate, Emmanuel, that your paper is a cross-country study, but from your research, do you think there is any scope in African economies for greater use of industrial parks, as in Ethiopia, in order to maximize cluster and agglomeration effects? Thank you.
Okay, so
there is a lot of noise at my background, but I don't know if it's clear for you to hear me. Can you? Okay.
We can hear you.
John, thank you very much for your question. Yes, and the industrial parks are very important for industrialization. And in Africa, we are seeing this in Ethiopia. And if you look at the numbers, shielding some positive results. There's basically no doubt that using industrial parks will offer African economies more opportunity to learn. That's basically what you're saying, agglomeration and scale economies. And this could spill over to other sectors. So I basically agree with your point, but the focus of my research was basically to document some trends of industrialization in Africa. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Harouna, do you want to just pick up Paul's final point, and when we'll close up in the next 30 seconds or so? Please note you're on mute.
Okay, thank you for your question and your suggestion. I think that on this study, we don't focus on the determinant of corruption, but I think that what you say is very important. There are a link between corruption and deindustrialization. So we'll try to handle this on the next paper.
Okay. Thank you very much, Harouna, and thank you, everyone. We've come to the end of our allotted slot, and as I said this morning, the CSAE conference waits for no one. So we've got to be very strict on time. First of all, let me thank Emmanuel, Kristina, Marcos, and Harouna for great papers, some really good questions, and I hope you've all found it useful. I think it's been a great session. Second thing I'd like to say is that we have the final macro session starting in 30 minutes at 4 o'clock, and this is on taxation and tax administration. I look forward to seeing as many of you as are able to turn up for the 4 o'clock session to round out what I think is going to be a great day of presentations. Thank you again to the presenters, thank you again to the audience, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.